So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this. We have a set of very distinguished scholars that we asked to kick things off to sort of start the discussions, and we're very pleased that Sherry Towers is going to do the lead off here. Sherry's background is actually in physics, but as she noted, she has a wide range of interests in computational methods in epidemiology, and she's going to talk to us specifically about contagion and mass shootings. So, Sherry, thank you very much for...
Thank you for having me. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this. I think it's actually a really awesome idea, and it's wonderful that we all could get together with people with such a diverse range of backgrounds. So it is true, I have a PhD in physics. I most of the time don't do physics anymore. How physics manifests itself in my research program these days is I take the modeling experience I have from physics, both from the mathematical and computational side, and I apply it to problems in epidemiology and public health and the social sciences. So I am a research faculty at the Levin Center. There's the long title of it. We just call it the Levin Center now, at Arizona State University. And the kind of research program I have actually fits in very well with the mandate of center. We have students and faculty who work on a broad array of problems in the life and social sciences. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a study we did of contagion and mass shootings. If we have time, I would also like to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing in visual analytics developing visual analytics to try to maximize the impact of the research we do related to firearm violence to policymakers and other stakeholders. I also would like to talk to you about some of the stuff that we've been working on, where we've been looking at societal attitudes towards firearms and how people are using firearms and how you can actually go about assessing that, because I think it was you who mentioned that somebody mentioned that there's very little data available on firearms usage. All right, so contagion and mass killings analysis. So prior to January 21st, 2014, I actually primarily did modeling of diseases, was primarily like influenza, MRSA, Ebola, things of that nature. But on this day, I actually was due to have a meeting with some people I was collaborating with at Purdue University, and there was a shooting on campus. So a student walked into a classroom, shot another student dead, walked out, basically came outside and kneeled down and waited for the police to come and arrest him. And to this day, excuse me, I'm recovering from, excuse me, I got bronchitis, or had bronchitis. But in any case, we don't know why he did the shooting to this day, because he committed suicide when he was in jail. But that day, it occurred to me that that was the third school shooting I had heard about in approximately 10-day to 2-week period. And even for the US, which has a problem with this, more so than any other first world country, it struck me that that seemed like an awfully large number of school shootings to be occurring in an awfully small period of time. And so I talked to some of my colleagues, in particular Professor Anuj Mubai and the director of our center, Professor Carlos Castillo-Chavez, and these are our students at the time, who worked on this. And so I talked to them about approaching this from a contagion perspective and perhaps trying to see if there was any evidence, statistical evidence of contagion in these kinds of events. So USA Today, many people are probably aware of this, USA Today, they've stopped maintaining it, unfortunately. So they stopped data taking in 2017, but they actually had fairly comprehensive list of mass shootings, or mass killings actually. So at least 4 people killed by any means. Most of these are shootings. And they have them, you can separate them by whether they were family or public. Brady Campaign, I contacted the Brady Campaign and they were very kind. And they shared with me some data sets. One was school shootings since 1996, and those on average happen about once a month in the US. They also shared me with a mass shootings data set. So these are 3 or more people shot, not necessarily killed. And these actually happen very frequently in the US. So frequently, actually, they rarely make it past the local news. So what we did is to separate this data set from our other mass shootings data set is we separated out where we just excluded ones where there was 4 or more people killed. So the way we approach this analysis is we used what's called a Hawkes point process model, and I believe George Moeller will be talking about this later. So what the idea is that you have some baseline probability, and here I've just shown it as flat, so uniform probability, but it can have temporal trends of an event occurring just by mere random chance. So nothing to do with contagion. It could be other things that are happening in the person's life, emotional stressors, whatever. But the idea behind a Hawkes point process model is that in addition to this baseline probability, that if there was an event that occurs, it temporarily increases the odds of another event occurring in the near future. So in our particular analysis, we assumed that that decays away with an exponential probability distribution. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, this perhaps wasn't the best choice, and certainly something you can ask me about after the talk about what alternate choices would be. But basically what happens is if there is contagion evident, what happens is you see unusual bunching together in time of these events beyond just what you would expect from your baseline probability. All right, so I know most people here do not have a mathematics background, so I'll just pop this up. These are the equations for the model. And so what we did is we took this model and we fit the parameters of this model. In particular, this we call it the excitation period, is the average of that exponential distribution. We also fitted for the number of secondary events that each mass shooting would be expected to incite, and then this is your baseline number of events that you would expect per day. All right, so I briefly mentioned, I'm not going to talk about this too much more because I suspect George is going to be talking about this, but we assumed an exponential probability distribution, but it could have been something like a power law distribution, which has very long tails, or it could have been something like the gamma distribution, of which the exponential distribution is a subset, where it's more of a bump, where there's kind of like a delay in the effect. There's other distributions you can choose, for instance, Weibull or log normal distributions. So fitting to the data, what we did is we used negative binomials. This is count data, number of events per day. And what we did is we used negative binomial likelihood fits to fit to the data. And we used unbinned maximum likelihood fits to maximize the statistical power of our analysis. So I wrote, for the WordPress site, I wrote actually like a kind of a missive on, which probably is boring to most everybody, but basically on statistical issues in dealing with crime in general, like crime data in general, but for mass shootings, there are some difficulties that are presented by those, part of which is they're rare. And so if you're looking for subtle effects, you have to use the most statistically powerful methods. In this case, unbinned maximum likelihood, if you can use it, is always preferable. So if contagion is evidence, this unusual bunching together in time, what we find is, so what we do is we first fit a model that doesn't have a contagion component, and then we fit a model that does have a contagion component. And there is a test called the Wilks likelihood ratio test that you can use to statistically test whether or not one model is favored over the other. And what we did then was we also validated our models using a method called k-fold validation. So we randomly selected half of the model, and we saw how well it predicted the other half of the model. Model validation is something that's unfortunately ignored too often, but when we're dealing with models where we would like to do forecasting, it's really important to ensure that your models actually have good predictive capability, and this is one method for helping to ensure that. So the results of this analysis, what we found was that this is the number of secondary events, so the average number of events that each mass shooting would be expected to incite. And this is the length of the excitation period. And so what we found, and this is the p-value that comes from that likelihood ratio test I was talking about. So what we found is that for USA Today data, this is the mass shootings with at least 4 people killed, we found significant evidence of contagion, that the contagion model was favored. And we found that on average, each mass shooting appears to incite 0.3 other mass shootings. And the average length of that contagion period is 13 days. When we fit to this Brady school shootings data, which is almost exclusive, by the way, because school shootings tend to be low casualty counts, this was almost statistically separate, independent from the USA Today mass shooting data. We found that there was significant evidence of contagion again. We found that each school shooting seemed to incite about 0.22 other school shootings. And again, we found that the length of the excitation period was 13 days. When we looked at mass shootings with less than 3 people killed, so there's at least 3 people shot, but less than 3 people killed, and like I said, these happen really frequently, we found no evidence of contagion. So no statistically significant evidence of contagion. And so when we looked at, so we were looking at this and it's like, what, you know, this is interesting. Like, we look at these 2 independent data sets and we get very similar results. What's different about this one? And one of the things we had to do in this analysis is we had to go through every single incident in the USA Today database and look at all of the details, basically from press reports, things of that nature. And one of the things that was actually the hardest part of this analysis. That was rough. There's only about, because you know, some of these things are family killings where somebody goes and kills everybody in their family, including the kids. And it was hard on both me and the graduate student who did it. Like, there's only about 2 or 3 hours that you can take of that before you're just done for the day. You can't do it anymore. But one of the things we noticed when we were going through those reports is that these ones were almost always local news reports, whereas these ones, even if a school shooting is low casualty count, it tends to make the national news because I think it grips the attention of people who are parents, their fears, speaks to their fears. And mass shootings where there's at least 4 people killed almost always make the national news. So this led us to posit that perhaps media attention paid to these events perhaps might be playing a role. So we can only posit that. We have no way of testing that other than the patterns we see in the data. All right. I already talked about that. However, that's not all of the story. We also, in that analysis, took a look at the per capita rates by state of these kinds of events. And we found that prevalence, so we looked at gun law legislative rankings, and there's some statistical issues associated with that because how you rank, you know, gun laws is a little bit arbitrary. Mass killings, so we looked at prevalence of firearm ownership and prevalence of mental illness from a NAMI study. And what we found is prevalence of mental illness was not significantly correlated. So if I recall correctly, any correlation that you see here, absolute value greater than 0.27, if I recall correctly, is significant, or maybe it's 0.29. So we found that prevalence of mental illness was not really associated significantly too much with these things. No, it was more than 0.27. I can't remember what the significance value of this was. But when we looked at prevalence of firearm ownership, it was. So easy access to firearms seems to perhaps play a role. Again, correlation doesn't equal causation, so you always have to have that caveat there. So why do we do mathematical modeling of firearm violence? And so one of the things I always tell my students when I'm giving classes on basically mathematical modeling in social sciences or epidemiology is eyes on the prize is usually control, either forecasting or control, most of the time control. And so now that we have some sense perhaps from that study where you can posit that there's these things playing a role, no proof of it, but you can posit that there's compelling, you know, patterns that you see there, how can we use this to inform control? Well, in the stages of a contagious process, the individual first needs to be susceptible. And then they need to be exposed through some way to another infectious individual. And that can happen either through direct contact or through a vector, which could be, for instance, media or a mosquito in the case of some diseases. And even if you are exposed, there are methods, like you can treat the person such that they are less infectious. So you can use treatments. And even once the infections, these interventions can reduce infectiousness. And so for those of you who have done disease modeling, usually the best bang for your buck comes from intervening earlier in that contagion process rather than waiting for the final stages. All right, so the FBI stages of the active shooter are fantasy. So this is where the person has been ideated with the idea to perhaps do this thing. They're thinking about it, they're dreaming about it. this is where, if you wanted to violate the First Amendment of the media, you could do media control. I'm not sure how effective that is, but mental health care access. So basically treating mentally ill people such that they don't become ideated, or if they do become ideated, that helps medicate them and gives them cognitive behavioral therapy to try to avoid the urges that they might be feeling. The FBI talks about planning and preparation. To be honest with you, I'm not sure what the difference is between those, but there are the two stages. And so this is where the person is now acting upon their ideation, and they are equipping themselves to actually do the deed. This is where, for instance, preventing people who are at risk, who either have a history of violence or a history of severe mental illness, where gun control can come in. Approach and implementation. This is where the person is now approaching the venue where they want to do this. Implementation is where they actually start shooting. And this is where the armed citizens, the good guys with a gun, can potentially, if you give that credence, can potentially have some kind of effect there. But that's at the very end stage of this whole process that leads to that occurring. All right, so this is preliminary work that I am working on with colleagues at, this is Danielle Wallace at the ASU School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and this is David Hemingway at the Harvard School of Public Health. And so this is a model that we are looking at that's a mathematical model, dynamical model, compartmental model, where you could have susceptible unarmed individuals, and they can become armed. They decide that they want to buy a gun, or an armed susceptible individual. So this is not somebody who's been ideated. This is a mentally healthy person, nonviolent person. They can decide to divest themselves of their guns. Susceptible unarmed people can become ideated unarmed people. So perhaps, and there's various ways that can happen. It doesn't have to be through contagion. There can be things that are happening in their lives that cause them to start thinking about doing these kinds of deeds. And this is certainly where things like mental health can come into play here, mental health care access. And these ideated unarmed people can become ideated armed people. They've now got their firearms, and these are the kind of people who can now perpetrate the events. So with these models, you can actually write down a set of mathematical equations. But again, eyes on the prize is control. So you can look at, once you have this model fit to data, and this is one of my research specialty, I actually fit these kinds of models to data. And in some cases, especially with nonlinear models, that takes specialized methods, computationally intensive methods, to actually do that kind of parameter fitting. But in addition to that, one of the things that I really haven't seen talked about is the time needed. So we talk about, well, if we did gun control, perhaps there's potentially some fraction of mass shootings that would prevent. It's not going to prevent all of them. And so there has to be that realism involved that not all measures are going to be 100% efficacious. In fact, probably none would be, but it's like you've got to chip away at the problem. So there is that issue, like how much would it reduce? But there's also the time frame that's needed to reduce it. And so when you're talking about policymakers, this is people who are in state and federal legislators, the time frame that they care about is 2 to 6 years, because they're on a re-election time frame. So from their perspective, they're on a time frame, say on average 4 years. And if you were to say there's this kind of intervention that you can do, and it'll reduce mass shootings by 50%, but it's going to take 20 years. But there's this other intervention that you can do that'll reduce mass shootings by 25%, but you'll see the reduction in 18 months. They would clearly want something that is of the shorter time frame, because that's what they care about. There is this old adage that the job of an elected official, as they see it, is to run for re-election. So basically, that's always in their mind. So this is something that we're working on, and certainly the time frame aspect, from a mathematical modeling perspective, is interesting, and that's something certainly that where the full brunt of mathematical modeling can come to bear. All right, so this is also something we're working on. This is preliminary work, again, with Danielle Wallace at the ASU School of Criminology and David Hemingway. And we have been working on trying to develop visual analytics related to many of the things we do. And so this is a very preliminary, very rough visual analytics application. So this is online. You guys, So this is, you can actually go to this URL. This is publicly available application. And what we've done is we've taken the supplementary homicide reports for multiple victims' homicides. And we have this application, this visual analytic, it's written in R Shiny, reads in this data. And it basically does a couple of statistical analyses on that data, one related to the temporal trends, the annual per capita rates, and the other related to whether or not the average number of casualties per incident have been rising in time. This is a hotbed of debate within the criminology literature about whether or not these things are becoming more frequent. There's some people who are saying, yes, they are, and other people are like, no, they're not. And there's other things like whether or not this particular application doesn't look at whether or not assault weapons were used. But that's the other thing of debate, is whether or not assault weapons actually make a difference in the casualty counts, or even whether assault weapons are becoming more frequently used. With the SHR data, they have data on the number of victims who were killed. They have data on whether or not the victims knew the perpetrator. Whether or not the incident was related to some other crime, for instance, gang or drugs, for instance. And here what we have is a selection bar where you can select on the number of casualties killed, because the other problem in the literature is like, no, you should be using 4 people killed, at least 4 people. No, you should be using at least 6 people killed. You should be using my selections. And so what we're trying to do is, in the research we do, we're trying to basically make the data accessible to public and policymakers, where they can make selections on the data and look at the trends. So we have, of course, our publications where we describe the statistical methodology, and you have like your plots in the publications, but you're relying then on our selections of the data, and those might not be the selections that are important to you. So one of the things that is definitely coming to note, that I've been coming to note in mass shootings data, is that context completely matters. So for instance, from the public's perspective, one of the things that they fear is being shot by a stranger. Like when people are talking about carry, and I want to be the good guy with the gun, they're not thinking about a family member coming to get them. They're thinking about they're in a public place and a complete stranger is coming to shoot them, and they want to be able to defend themselves. So this is why we have these radio buttons where you can select on these things. So if you look here, this shaded area is the federal assault weapons ban, was in effect from September 1994 to September 2004. And so this trend here is an unbinned negative binomial population standardized likelihood fit, and I talk about that on that thing I wrote for the website. And so this is just overall trend. But we have a radio button here that allows you to look at it both during and after. So if we were to click on that, it'll have a separate slope, and it takes a little bit of a while because actually this is complicated, what's being done here. And so it'll give you a separate slope. So during the percentage increase per year during the federal assault weapons ban is not significant, but after the lapse of the ban, the slope is significant. The number of casualties per incident has gone significantly up since the lapse of the ban. But this is in mass shootings where the perpetrator did not know the victim. So if we were to look at whether or not the perpetrator knew at least some of the victims, you see completely different trends. So context completely matters in mass shootings. So you can also select on the number of casualties killed, number of people killed, and so you can go all the way down to 2 if you wanted. Things of this nature. And so if you go all the way down to 2, even when the perpetrator knew at least some of the people, you can see that there is a significant trend upwards after the lapse of the ban. And so this allows policymakers, any other stakeholders, public, to actually play with the data. It gives full transparency. We actually have a thing here that allows you to download the data set. We didn't compile this data set. It was compiled by these, I give the citation up here, yeah, right here, by Jacob Kaplan. And so it allows you to download it. And so it basically allows complete transparency in what we do. And in some of the things that I have seen in the literature related to mass shootings, transparency is important. All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right. So we've been trying to do that for most of the things that we do these days. All right. Visual analytics. All right, so one of the other things that we've been looking at is studies of American firearm usage practices and attitudes towards firearms and firearm violence, because there has been a lot of focus on the end result of firearm violence, like looking at not just violence, but also accidents and things of that nature. But what drives policy, federal or state or local, is what the voters want. And so measuring people's attitudes to firearm violence and also trying to assess how people are using firearms, because a lot of, especially with pressure from the gun lobby, a lot of data sources have dried up over the past 10 years. So what we try to do is try to use indirect data sources to try to infer what people are doing. So a good example of this is a study that we currently have under review, where we looked at TSA data, where they basically, when the TSA detects a firearm, they record the airport at which it was detected. They record the date it was detected. They record the caliber of the firearm. They record whether it was loaded, and they record whether it has a round chambered. Do people here know what I mean by a round chambered? All right, I'm about to describe that. So they make this data available off of their weekly blog. And so they've been doing so since 2012. So round chambered means that, so you have, when your firearm is loaded, if it has a magazine, you have a magazine in the weapons that has ammunition in it, or if it's a revolver, you've got bullets in the revolving part. When a round is chambered, what it means is that there is a round of ammunition in the chamber of the weapon nestled up against the firing pin of the weapon. So I grew up in northern Vancouver Island in an area where basically everybody hunts. And if you don't hunt, you still own long guns because you inherited them from your grandpa or something. But in any case, I was taught to shoot when I was 8. And so basically the first lesson is you never chamber a round unless you're about to fire that firearm. It's basically you just don't ever, ever have a round chambered in your firearm unless you're about to fire it. So when you look at gun enthusiast websites in the United States, carrying with a round chambered, so that means you will have, you're doing like either concealed or open carry of your firearm. The idea behind wanting to carry with a round chamber is that it reduces reaction time in a threat situation, such as when a dude in a hockey mask is coming at you carrying what may or may not be a machete. I'm not sure what he's carrying there. And so when you have a round chambered, your firearm is at most 2 steps from being fired. Either if your firearm has a safety, and not all do, there's several pistols that do not have safeties. If you have a safety, you nearly need to turn it off and then just pull the trigger. So with the rise in popularity of carrying with a round chambered, there are firearm owners who are worried that it might do harm to their firearm. But what they should really be worried about is whether or not it does harm to them. So when we look through the literature, let's move past that. When we look through the literature, we found 0 on round chambered. Like there's been some studies of people storing their firearms loaded. No one has looked at the issue of round chambered despite the safety risks that it poses. So police will typically carry with a round chambered for good reason. The military is not allowed to carry with a round chambered unless they're basically in active combat. It's the only time they're allowed to carry with a round chambered because it's very, very unsafe. So what we did, this is the group of collaborators I worked with me on this. And so what we did is we took the TSA data and we looked at how often, because the TSA data records whether the firearm was loaded and whether or not it additionally had a round chambered. And we looked at temporal and geospatial trends in this data. And what we found, just out of interest, what percentage of people do you think carry with a round chambered in the TSA data? What percentage of firearms do you think were found with a round chambered? You're closer, yeah, so almost 40. So these are the temporal trends. And so what we found is that when we look at it per passenger, So this is by quarter per passenger. There's been an upward trend. However, TSA detection efficiency can be playing a role in that. So as the TSA gets better able to detect these things, you would perhaps expect that to go up. So you can't really just assume that that is a given. However, you can look, because the TSA is a federal agency and the machinery and the training is the same place by place, you can use this data not necessarily for temporal, but you can look at geospatial trends in this kind of thing. When we looked at the fraction of firearms detected that were found to be loaded, now this is independent of TSA detection efficiencies because that affects both the numerator and the denominator. We found that there was significant trend upwards, and we used a method called beta binomial logistic regression to examine that. And when we looked at the fraction of loaded firearms that were also found to have a round chambered, there was very significant trend upwards. Again, we use beta binomial logistic regression for that. So currently it's almost 40% when you look at that data. So there are clearly some limitations with this data. Oh, some of the findings. So states that have child access prevention laws, we found it actually, in those states there were significantly fewer firearms to be found loaded. So child access prevention laws seem to have some kind of effect in at least educating people in what constitutes unsafe storage. So we don't know whether these firearms that were detected were stored or carried. So whether or not, so people will just say, oh, I forgot that it was in my luggage. And so maybe they're telling the truth that they actually had sloppily stored their firearm in unlocked luggage in their house and just, packed everything in there and forgot the firearm was in there. But some fraction of these people are almost certainly people who actually carried into the airport, like they are in the habit of carrying, and they either forgot it was in their purse or on their person. I'm not sure how you can be a male and forget that you had it on your person. But these are, we don't know, and we have no way of knowing what the intent of these people were and how that firearm ended up being actually brought through a TSA checkpoint. So these people are probably not the average firearm owner. They're probably not, because these are people who are sloppy enough to either think that they can take a firearm through, or sloppy enough to forget that they had stored this thing in their luggage. So they're probably not the average firearm owner, but maybe they are. We have no way of knowing. But the temporal trends that we see in the number and the fraction that are found loaded and the fraction that actually have a round chambered is actually really worrisome. And actually, I'm about to tell you, mass shootings may be playing a role in these trends. But this study's under review. Knock on wood that it'll be published without too much problem. But this will be the first study of its kind that looks at firearms with a round chambered in any context. And I think it would be very interesting to actually do some survey studies to try to determine what the popularity is of this. And there's also, and how it affects things like firearm accidents, negligent discharge, kids, because now a kid, if they get a hold of that firearm and it has a round chambered and it doesn't have a safety or the safety's off, all they have to do is pull the trigger. Because most 3-year-olds wouldn't know how to chamber a round in things like a pistol. All right, so this is another preliminary study that we're working on. That what we did is we looked at when you overlay, and you can ask me about this later, but when you overlay the timing of mass shootings and the temporal trends in the fraction of firearms that are found, loaded firearms that are found to have a round chambered, you can see that if there's a long time period between mass shootings, that fraction goes down and then it kind of goes up again when there's another mass shooting. And so this is a student who is working with me. He's since graduated at the School of Criminology at ASU. Excuse me. And so what we looked at this data, what we did is we looked at the odds ratio from the week before that a firearm was found to be loaded, and with round chambered that was loaded. And then we looked at, after a mass shooting occurred, how did that odds ratio change? And so what we found is immediately after a mass shooting, that odds ratio for finding a firearm with a round chambered actually went up significantly. And the longer you went past a mass shooting, the more that odds ratio decayed relative to what it had been the week before the mass shooting. So, and that slope is significant. And so it appears that there is, perhaps mass shootings are actually making people fearful. or at least the people who would bring their firearms through the TSA, it's making them fearful, where they feel like, oh, I've got to be on the alert, I've got to be the good guy with the gun. But then as time goes on, they realize I almost just shot my foot off with this firearm. Because for every negligent discharge that results in injury, I am sure there are many, many more that do not result in injury. All right, I do have time for this, good. So another thing, this is another preliminary study that we're working on, is assessing temporal changes in attitudes towards firearms and how the demographics of those people who are expressing those attitudes are changing. So the We the People website at whitehouse.gov is a petition server where you can go to that website and you can start a petition on any topic. And so if you get at least 150 signatures, that petition becomes searchable, and then other people they can go to the website and find it, and they can sign it. So this started in September 2011, I believe is when it began. And the White House says, so it began under the Obama administration, and the White House then said that if a petition gets at least 100,000 signatures, they will respond to the petition. They don't say when they'll respond to the petition, but they do say that they'll respond to the petition. In fact, the actual when matters for some of these petitions, because some have never really been responded to. And so what I did is I downloaded all of the petitions. So when you sign the petition, you enter your email address, so you have an account. You enter your email address and your name. And in the data as it used to be, they no longer make this data public, it used to be that you would have access publicly to the person's zip code of residence and their initials. So you knew where, and what's nice about this is people are telling you what they're thinking and where and when they were thinking it, which is very nice. So the firearms, gun violence related petitions are not the most popular, but there's still many, many of them. And what I did is I went to this website and I downloaded all of the gun violence firearms related petitions. And some of these were bogus, like you had to go through each and every one, because some of them were like, allow the state of Alaska to secede, or big party in the USA, the national anthem. That actually was one of them under gun violence, and I have no idea what that has to do. And so downloaded all these, and it was many petitions, if I recall correctly, several million signatures in the end. So I have all that data. It's now since changed, and now what's kind of problematic about this analysis is you can't access that old data anymore. The current administration flushed it. So I have no idea how you can, whether even, because Freedom of Information Act, if it's too big a data set, you have to pay for it, and this is a big data set. All right. Yeah, so the petition server was created over a year before the Newtown massacre in December 2012. And so the idea behind this analysis is to look at the zip code of residence where people said they were and try to infer their demographics from the zip code of residence. So basically take census data and look at what the, for instance, population density, what the household income, what the racial demographics, basically socioeconomic demographics related to where these people live. And I think I actually took the zip code and translated it to counties, because there's more complete data for that. And so what we did is we divided the petitions into ones that were pro-gun control and anti-gun control. So some of these are strongly pro-Second Amendment, and others are like calling for stricter gun control. And we looked at the apparent demographics of the people. So now we're looking at the county demographics. So when I talk about change in demographics, I'm not talking about the people changing. It's like the location of where these people are who are expressing these. And so this is, again, preliminary. But what we find, so the blue lines are the national average and the spread in the national average for the various population demographics we have here. So we have population density, and you can see that before Newtown, both pro, which is green, so pro-gun control, and anti-gun control people were more or less about the national average. With percentage white, the people who were pro-gun control were about the national average. The people who were anti-gun control, pro-Second Amendment, were more white. Median household income, more or less close to the national average, although people who were pro-gun control tended to be more affluent. better educated, although the people who were anti-gun control were about the national average. Percentage veteran in the military, there was a higher percentage prior to Newtown who were expressing those opinions on the Second Amendment. Age demographics about the same. Percentage household firearm ownership. So this is before Newtown, and these are the pro-Second Amendment people, and they were about the national average as far as their firearm ownership. Firearm accidental death rates about the same. Homicide rates, more or less the same, although these people are actually coming from relatively low violent crime areas. Republican, these are people who are about the national average, the pro-Second Amendment people, so 2012, 2016. Violent crime rate, again, these people who are pro-Second Amendment were actually coming from relatively low crime areas. But when you look at what happened after Newtown, virtually all of these indicators diverged, strongly diverged. And so what you see is after Newtown, you see this divergence in just who is stating strong opinions, pro and con gun control. And so this has, it doesn't mean that the people who are expressing opinions here no longer feel, if it doesn't mean that the people who are very pro-Second Amendment here have suddenly become pro-gun control. It just means that they're not expressing the strong opinions. Does that make sense? So they become perhaps more moderate and not really speaking out as much on that topic. And so what's interesting about this is these people who are expressing strong opinions are the people who are most likely to be calling their Congress people to ask for change. And so you have a very kind of this divergence in who these people are, and the middle road people are not basically saying a whole lot anymore. All right, the timing of these things, so this is mass shootings, and the black circles represent the number of people killed, and this is time. And then the red circles represent the pro-Second Amendment. So these are anti-gun control petitions, and the size of the circles represents the number of signatures. And these are the pro-gun control petitions. And what we find is in the timing of these petitions that the pro-gun control ones tend to almost always come right after a big mass shooting. So basically, these people are not expressing strong opinions unless there was like a mass shooting that basically incited them to do so. Whereas these people, there is evidence that yes, after mass shootings, they also are having something to say. But they also were doing petitions that were completely had nothing to do with the timing of the timing of mass shootings. And so for these people, every time they look at their firearm when they take it out to go to the shooting range, they're thinking I don't want the government to control this. And so there is clearly some impetus for these people beyond just, the societal, tragedies of mass shootings that is causing them to petition the government. Overall, there are actually more petition signatures on pro-Second Amendment, anti-gun control, than there are on these, even though this one here, right after Newtown, was the biggest petition ever that the government had gotten, the most signatures ever. So the question is, so you have these people, you have more signatures on the pro-Second Amendment ones. Does that mean that these people are actually more populace? Like, do they represent the greater part of the populace? And so what we did then is we now use that zip code plus signature data. And what it is, because you have the two initials. And so what you can do is you can scramble them to get your expected probability that by mere random chance, so my initials are ST, by mere random chance within my zip code, there's going to be people who have initials ST. But what you can do is you can scramble the first and last initial and kind of try to get a handle on what that probability is. And so what we do is we do that scrambling, and we kind of get what the expected probability is of overlap from past petitions. And when we do that for the pro-gun control and anti-gun control petitions, so the red line is by mere random chance. Unfortunately, I haven't assessed the confidence interval on that. I need to add that to this plot. And then the black line is what is observed overlap from previous petitions. And so you can see for the pro-gun control petitions, right after Newtown, there was a fair amount of overlap with people who had signed a prior petition. But then, since then, it's been about what you would expect by mere random chance. But for these people, particularly as time goes on, these are the pro-Second Amendment anti-gun control petitions, more and more as time goes on, they are repeat signers. So, or appear to be repeat signers, where they're just continuing going back, and if they see a petition headed their way, they will sign it. There's other things, and I don't have a plot for it, that's interesting about this data, is you have down to the second when the person signed it. And so when you look at that within petition, the pro-gun control petitions tend to have, if this is, ignore this now, if these are your X and Y axis and this is time since the petition started, they have a shape where there's a really strong peak and then it rapidly within literally like a day or two drops off. And so even though petitions open for 30 days, the vast majority of the petition signatures are coming within that first 48 hours. In contrast, when you look at the anti-gun control petitions, pro-Second Amendment, they have an entirely different shape. And this is, I'm talking about petition to petition, petition. They almost look identical. True for both groups. That now when you look at it, it has kind of this slow kind of, and then it kind of, and there's like this really long tail to it. And so that tells me that the spread of information within those two groups is very different, and the dynamics that are underlying, what's leading them to express a strong opinion are very different. So with the pro-gun control people, within 2 days after that mass shooting, they're not signing that petition. So it's almost like they have either lost interest or the spread of information about that petition is happening on kind of a social network that has much faster spread of information, like for instance, Twitter. Whereas the other people who are the pro-Second Amendment people, where they have that much longer spread, that can be evidence of they have a kind of a longer term investment, emotional investment in that topic, but it also can potentially reflect the way the social network that's spreading that information is inherently slower, like for instance, email. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you. Great presentation, by the way, just wonderful.
Thank you.
I was going to say, it's an anecdotal comment I was going to raise. Remember back about half a year ago, the FBI agent in Colorado, and he was dancing. I think most people know about that. And I'm obviously, I think he had it chambered, because when it fell, it shot.
Yeah.
So just something, and so just wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I wonder, for your last slide, a lot of, at least from my own experience, this is just anecdotal, but a lot of times when you're the type of person that would sign a gun legislation, petition, you're also signing a lot of petitions about family separation at the border and those sorts of things, and you have a lot of those kind of coming at you, and maybe that's why the contagion is not the same as in the anti-gun legislation group.
Well, you don't think the anti-gun legislation group would also be signing those petitions?
I don't know, that's why I say it's anecdotal. I have no idea. So maybe, have you looked at that?
So it's really hard because the data's been flushed, so I can't go back and look at it. But, and I'm pretty sure it's basically, we'll never see that data again, even with the Freedom of Information Act request, you're never going to see that data again. And so it would be very difficult to go back and look at it. But the other problem is that the new data doesn't include the zip code or they don't make that public anymore. So it's not something you can go back and look at. But of the petitions that I downloaded, it was too big of, this is on my laptop. So when I say it's big, but it's not like big data. Like I used to have to work with as a physicist. So I don't have the resources at my university to store that kind of data. So I only have the ones that are related to gun control and vaccination. So the reason we downloaded the vaccination ones is also related to this, whether or not the people who are saying the most or whether they are actually the majority. So with the anti-vax, so people who are pushing for more stringent vaccination laws versus people who are saying, no, this is government tyranny. When you look at those groups of petitions, there's more anti-vax petitions than petition signatories than the other group. And when you look, and the other issue is whether or not those demographics that I showed you are actually accurate. And so when we look at the demographics of the pro-vaccine versus anti-vaccine, we see that the demographics of the anti-vaccine by this methodology actually matches what studies have done, where they've actually looked at the people individually and tried to measure those things. So the only petitions we have are on those two topics, unfortunately, because it's way too big a data set for me to actually download and have that manageable, unfortunately, and now it's gone. But good question. I hoard data, by the way. I don't know if you get that sense, but I've got data. Like if any of you have something that involves any kind of socioeconomic, I've got time series and down to, always at the county level, I've got a huge array of information on socioeconomic demographics, health indicators, all kinds of the violent crime, all kinds of different things. And if any of you are working on something that you would like to collaborate with me on, I've got this, and I've got a time series and geospatial. But yeah, I got a lot of data.
I was wondering if there was a similarity between, as you were implying, maybe the spread of information, social networking, and that might be one of the differences, whether that could tie into one of the first things you talked about, which was your length of excitation period. And I was wondering if the length of excitation period, I think it was about 18 days.
14.
14 days.
But 2 weeks, 13.
Might correlate with either a news cycle or a news interest level and how long that media goes, and whether it correlates with that cycle, and whether the spread of information, particularly in a more pro-gun control media, might be spreading that quickly after an event and then die down, whereas the pro-Second Amendment might have their own internal clock.
Yeah. And so one of the things that kind of is on my heap of my endless inbox, it's like this high, like I'll never get through it all before I die. My husband says he'll do me a favor and engrave it on my tombstone for me. But one of the things that I'd like to look at, for instance, Google Trends data is something that you can look at, or you can also look at social media data like Twitter data, and look at people's interest in a topic after an event happens. And I have this feeling, although I completely have not looked at it, and I'd be happy to be proved otherwise, that people's interest in the topic may be that length of time, the decays, actually may be changing in time, and that would actually be a very interesting thing to do. The Twitter data, not free. Google Trends data is free.
Berkeley Media Studies has done this work, and they found about 8 days.
With the petition server? Or
No, with the Google Trends and social media stuff, and on average, a mass shooting gets about 8 days of media coverage.
And have they looked at the temporal trends in it?
I'm not sure about that. I was on a panel with her, and I know 8 days stuck in my head. That's yeah. So.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm so happy to hear your work, and you're contributing so much here. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew a few things, and then I want to just insert one point into the intervention idea. So it may or may not be known to everybody who's listening that the contagious nature of violence isn't just in mass shootings, but essentially is in every single aspect of violence. Community violence is contagious, as is child abuse, as is family violence, as is suicide, and of course as is war. And that these are different syndromes of the same problem. That is to say, exposure to war causes you more likely to do family violence. And all of these things interact with each other. And that violence meets the dictionary definition of disease, because it has characteristic signs and symptoms causing morbidity and mortality. And it meets the dictionary and normal dictionary and medical dictionary definition of contagious, because it produces more of itself. Therefore, it is a contagious disease, since it meets all of the criteria as a whale meets all of the criteria of being a mammal. So although people may not know about it giving live birth and being warm-blooded and all of these things, it has all the population characteristics and the individual characteristics. But what isn't worked out, which is the primary reason that I came here, is that the kinetics of the likelihood of an infection taking or of it progressing to disease is not clear, as it is for TB or malaria or for measles or for rabies. And not only that, so many of the other aspects of the progression of the pathogenesis of it, as well as the importance of contact tracing. We know how important it is to do contact tracing for syphilis or for gonorrhea or for AIDS or for TB. And these are the things that are still missing in the design of the strategies for reducing violence. And so I come from the world of actually intervention, and we're doing intervention in this disease almost exactly the way we're doing it for TB. And similarly for cholera, almost exactly the same, using health workers, not using broad mental health applications, but very specific linear outreach and interruption of its spread, and getting reductions that are very, very fast, usually within the first couple months. And this is what's happening with malaria now, by transmission interruption and so on. And this is mostly summarized in an Institute of Medicine report of 2012. I think that is on our website, and the article I wrote called "Violence is a Contagious Disease" has been sent here and downloaded onto whatever the web situation is. So these are the missing pieces in control, is looking at it the way that Sherry is looking at it, but not just for mass shootings, and of course for suicides, which is almost the same as a mass shooting in many, many ways, but also on community violence and on family violence and all of these other things. And so the last thing that I wanted to insert, maybe everybody in this room knew this, the breadth of this and the specificity of this. Every population characteristic, clustering, epidemic waves, and communicability, check, check, check. And every individual characteristic, latency, all these things, they all are completely conform. It's just been misdiagnosed as a problem of bad people, just as leprosy and plague and these other things used to be thought to be. So this is an infectious disease that we're talking about, but the infectious disease math is not laid out. The specific thing I wanted to add is the work that, I can't remember which of you showed so many studies that you're doing with Hemingway and others, where the interventions are very, very early versus later, and it's mental health versus something having to do with gun control, and then the most proximate and immediate is a good guy with a gun, has nowhere near the evidence as violence interruption has, nor the immediacy. And so I just would suggest that you get that into that model.
So we actually had, it was in there. So it actually, yeah, you're right, it's way back there.
I'm sorry if I missed that.
Dun, dun, dun.
And just on this
So
point about violence.
I think I actually say that, don't I? Somewhere, a good guy with a gun? Is it on the previous slide? But it is where that would come in is actually intervening right here. Is the good guy with the gun. Basically, that they are preventing that arrow, so they would help reduce that arrow.
That is not the correct intervention, most likely, in terms of where the evidence sits right now.
Yeah, for efficacy, it's like the end stage, like it's the absolute end stage. And when you look at events where there were people, so for instance, at Gabby Gifford's shooting, there actually was a guy who was carrying there, and he considered actually pulling his firearm, but then he realized he didn't know who the perpetrator was. And so he realized that he was just going to be shooting into a crowd of people blindly, and he prudently decided not to. So there have been documented cases where there are people who were armed who were there who did not have an effect.
Well, this was my point, is that if you're going to model something right there, it would have to be, you can model something that is ineffective or is negatively affected or that is, partially effective. But I would hope that you'd be able to insert into here some of the things that have more demonstrated relationship with changing
Absolutely.
the
And so that's the idea behind all these, is to all the different arrows that are, like this one would be, for instance, moving somebody who is from, we actually should probably have, so moving somebody from here to here means you're actually going to somebody who has a domestic abuse conviction, for instance, and actually going and taking their firearm. Instead of just saying to them, we'd like you to turn in your firearms, and they don't, and there's no repercussions for doing that. So for instance, I believe it was the Aurora, Colorado, Aurora, Illinois shooter, but was just not that long ago. The workplace shooting that happened in Aurora. And so he actually had a conviction, and he was told to hand in his firearms, and he never did, and they never went and got them. And so if we were to strengthen that system, that helps bring those people down here. The idea behind arming everybody, unfortunately, when you put that in the model, you also have to put it in here and in here. So you can't just say, oh, well, we're only going to arm these people. How do you know when you relax the gun laws that make guns easier for everybody to have, like these states that are passing laws now for permitless carry? It's permitless carry. They don't know who's buying these firearms, and so you would have to, if you were to put it in there, you have to put it in those two as well. So you're right that it's multifaceted, and that's what we're trying to incorporate in this model, is that multifaceted approach where you can say, like, look, you can put the people who are saying that if you were to institute gun control is not going to prevent all mass shootings are right. They're right. It's not going to prevent all mass shootings. The people who say that arming, basically having good guys with a gun everywhere, may or may not have a point. But with this kind of model, you take that into account. And what we would like to do is try to fit the parameters of this model to data to try to quantify what the relative weights of all these different things are, and to give it credence. So not just to say, we're not going to put the good guys with a gun in there because we think that's stupid, but to give it credence and then see if there's any statistical evidence. And the preliminary work I've done, there is very little statistical evidence that is actually an efficacious control measure.
I just want to say, I'm talking about something different from that, than doing
Excuse me.
all of these multiple things, and that there's all these things to be done. Because this has, I mean, if you insert this into the infectious disease realm, it's like trying to do everything for everyone who might ever have TB. But it isn't that. It's people who are, I mean, in order to reduce the spread of TB and therefore really stop an epidemic, it's finding the very, very most infectious people and then treating them immediately and then getting to their
And unfortunately, this model as it is right now, I'm not saying that it can't have it in it, but as it is right now, doesn't have core groups. Like, so what you're talking about is like the effect of core groups, and it doesn't have that in this model, but you're right, that actually is something that would be important to include. So core groups in things like diseases like sexual, so those who don't come from an epidemiology background, core groups for things like sexually transmitted diseases, there are certain groups within the population who are responsible for most of the transmission. And so the revolution happened in sexual disease transmission modeling when that mechanism, that dynamic was actually included in the model, because it's important to include it in the model to actually truly understand control. And that's actually a really good point. Really good point.
I think we need to give people a chance for a little break, but I want us to, first of all, thank Sherry.
Thank you.
And second of all, there were a number of issues in that last slide in this compartment model that came up here about estimating the rates from data and the structure of the model. And I hope that there's a discussion in the breakout groups about the methods from epidemiology and disease.
And that's something I have a lot of experience in is parameter
estimation, and how that can help us, and what new kinds of data and methodology do we need in order to do the appropriate estimation. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break.